So I'd like to invite Maitreyabandhu to come and join me. So if we could start with, I've given quite a potted history, but if you could tell us more about your background.
In terms of poetry or in terms of Buddhism, or both?
Both.
My background isn't very poetic, I'm afraid. In fact, I once wrote a poem which was rubbish, but I've written quite a few of those. But the first one said I did not have a very poetic background. I come from a very ordinary family in Warwickshire. My parents ran a coach firm and taxi firm business. No one was very literary in my family. I remember writing if you want to come and sit, there's a seat at the front if you'd be easier to hear. Do say if you can't hear me, I sometimes mumble. There's another seat here if you, it's a bit difficult acoustic in here sometimes, one's words disappear in the heavens. Yeah, one there, one here. Yeah, so I remember writing a poem when I was quite young about a hazelnut tree. And I remember my aunt refusing to believe that I'd written it. She thought I'd got it from somebody else, and that really put me off. It was one of those early times of not being believed by an adult, even though I was telling the truth. I mean, I often didn't tell the truth as a child. But it was the first time I remember being disbelieved when I was, and I remember being outraged about that. I then went on, I became a nurse for a few years. I was a nurse in Coventry, in the Walsgrave Hospital. All the way in my life I'd felt a sense that there must be more to life. I couldn't really quite say what that more was, but I felt there must be more to life. That life couldn't just be growing up, getting a career, getting a pension and dying. That there must be more to life. And that more mostly expressed itself in a desire to create. So I used to paint a lot. Not very well, but I used to paint. And I used to write little things, usually when I was miserable. Yes, and then I was a nurse for a while, and at the end of nursing, I had this dream to go to art college. And I remember I decided to go for this interview for art college, and I didn't really expect to get in, and I just brought these bits and bobs along with me. And it was the first time I'd ever talked about my own art. I mean, art is too grand a term, but there's things I'd been doing. And I chatted on in this interview, and halfway through the interview he said, "You've got the job. You're in." But I was so happy to be talking about painting that I just carried on talking. Eventually he said, "Look, I'm going to have to go and have my lunch." So I then went to art school. I went to Goldsmiths Art School in London, where I was at the same time with people like Damien Hirst and Sarah Lucas. I knew Sarah quite well, I knew both of them quite well. And then in the middle of being at art school, I got involved in Buddhism. I cycled to the London Buddhist Centre from my squat in Brixton on a November night. I was taught to meditate, and I seemed, that day I was taught to meditate, I felt, oh, I'm a Buddhist. I've always been a Buddhist. I always will be a Buddhist. I seem to know that immediately, somewhat, almost mystically in a way. As soon as I was taught to meditate, I knew I was a Buddhist. So for the next while, I just devoted myself to Buddhism, and poetry as such has only come into my life quite recently, since about 2007. So yeah, it's a potted history of what I've been up to, but I've always wanted more of life, and I think the two great routes to more in life, and I always mean that, I don't just mean more of life, more skiing, more bungee jumping, more things to buy. You can imagine I don't do any of those things, but I do the last one. I always mean more to life, that there was something deeper about life. And in in our life, the two great roads to that have been religion and art, haven't they? Or the arts. I gave up on religion when I was a child. I remember feeling quite clearly that I didn't believe in God. I remember trying to. Okay, I do, but I didn't. So I thought that road had been blocked. So art was the only other way to more, I thought. So Buddhism was a revelation, because I think Buddhism goes beyond religion and art. You see what I mean? It's something more than both, I think. Or it's both a part of Buddhism in my experience. But yeah, my experience was that I was a Buddhist that day, and I've hopefully never looked back.
And now, when you are being interviewed and discussing different areas, you're often referred to immediately as a Buddhist poet.
Yeah.
How does it feel to have that title?
Yeah, it's funny. Nearly every time now, in any time I'm mentioned, which frankly isn't that often, so let's keep it in perspective. A few times that I'm mentioned in the press, they tend to call me the Buddhist poet Maitreyabandhu. It's partly because of my name. It sort of explains my name. I was thinking about it. I feel sort of I'm in two minds about it, I suppose. I'm in two minds about so many things, but I'm sure we all are. The good thing about it is that the important thing about me is that I'm a member of a religious order. In a way, that's what's important about me, I feel, increasingly actually, is that I'm part of an order, a religious order, a Buddhist order, that are trying to collectively help other people, help themselves, and create meaning in life. For me, that's very important. So, being called a Buddhist poet, I'm very happy with it from that point of view, if you see what I mean. I'm very happy to be publishing it under my name, Maitreyabandhu. I don't ever use my given name. I just don't relate to that anymore. So, in that sense, I'm very happy with it. It shows that I'm a Buddhist. I'm part of a Buddhist order. When I give readings, I always wear my kesa. This shows that I'm a member of the Triratna Buddhist order. For me, one of the great discoveries in life was to join a whole community, not just to being a lone spiritual practitioner, which is so much the Western model at the moment, but to join a community of practitioners. It's important, very important, to be known as somebody that's part of a religious order, a Buddhist order. So that's the pro. The con was that when the collection came out, you get these weird misunderstandings. Buddhism still isn't very well known in the West. Even people who think they understand it often don't. So you get all these sort of things that people say, well, you shouldn't be... I've already had people say, well, I'm really surprised to see a Buddhist writing like this. And it's not a pleasant surprise. One of my poems, they said, was clearly about suicide. This poem is clearly about suicide. It's absolutely not about suicide, but never mind. And they were really shocked to see a Buddhist writing such things. And a sense that people already know the kind of thing you should write, and what's appropriate for a Buddhist to write. I dislike that. And I don't want to write... You can never write poems as in anything, however good that thing is. So, if you're a communist, you can't write communist poems. If you're a Buddhist, in a sense, you can't write Buddhist poems, in the sense that you can't put your case on and write. If they are Buddhist poems, it must be because I'm a Buddhist, and that's all. And the degree to which they are Buddhist poems must be to the degree to which I'm a Buddhist, not the degree to which I've tried to make them Buddhist poems. So it gets a bit frustrating when you hear people talk about the work as if through a lens of what they think Buddhism is or should be. It makes me want to write against it, in fact. In fact, I'm writing a long Christian poem at the moment, which I hope will upset all the right people. So I've got that mixed feeling. In one way, that's great that I'm thought of as a Buddhist poet. I am. I hope I am. But not in the way that I sit down thinking, how can I put Buddhism into this? That's not being a Buddhist poet, that's just being a member of a religious group. And I'm not a member of a religious group. A genuinely Buddhist poet would be someone who's writing out of a deeper experience. And I hope, to some degree, that's there in the poems.
So in one interview, you said that you considered all your works to either be overtly Buddhist or you hoped that they captured essence of sort of Buddhist ethics and values. You just said that you dislike this idea of I'm going to put on my kesa and then the sort of Buddhism will come out. But are there any particular processes you go through in order to connect with that deeper essence?
Buddhism is what I'm doing in my life. Even Buddhism is a funny word, isn't it? Because it suggests an ism, like Marxism, socialism, or so on, as if it's an ideology I have, which I need to find a way of squeezing into my poems. Buddhism isn't primarily an ideology. It's not primarily a belief. Buddhism is primarily something you do. The Buddhist word is gacchami, which means I go. So my own teacher was saying, a Christian says, El credo, I believe. Philosophers say, cogito, I think. And the Buddhist says, gacchami, I go. So Buddhism is primarily something you do, not something you believe. And what I primarily do is I try to live out real human value. I try to live out that as much as possible. Having said that, a lot of the poems start off, they nearly always start off on retreat. I go on retreat very often, I've just come back from retreat just now. And they quite often start in meditation. Sometimes as an image, sometimes rarely as a line, sometimes as an explanation to myself for what I'm trying to do. So there are poems here. There's one called The Shipwright, for instance, which I remember. Some of the poems I remember vividly the experience of them appearing. I'll say in a moment what I mean by that, but I was meditating on an intensive meditation retreat. And in the midst of that meditation, I was saying to myself, it's as if you have to go outside and find a nut and create this boat, and then you get on this boat and you go beyond, on this little boat in a nut. And that appeared to me in my meditation as a kind of metaphor for what I was trying to do in the meditation, which was to build a little raft, as it were, and go beyond myself. That's always what you're trying to do in meditation. Interestingly, it's always what you're trying to do in poetry. You're trying to make something, a little machine, as it were, that takes you a little bit beyond yourself. That's really what a poem is. It's not words on a page. A poem is always something a little bit beyond you. You're always trying to write something that you can't write. You're always trying to build a little boat that takes you a little beyond what you already know. And that's what meditation is as well. It's a technique, it's a set of practices that take you beyond what you already know, beyond your usual everyday mind. So my Buddhist practice, especially my meditation practice and poetry, have a natural relationship with each other. But yes, the poems often come out on retreat, almost inevitably, and particularly in meditation.
And when, so you talk about in meditation, the images coming to you quite vividly.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes just as distractions, I'm afraid.
To what extent do you feel that the meditation gives you a measure of control with your writing, and to what extent does it feel more like meditation just presents these images to you, and it's up to you to work from there?
Yeah, interesting. I don't think of meditation giving me control. It's more that meditation is a pathway to depth. And any decent speech, and W.H. Auden says that poetry is memorable speech. It's one of the great definitions of poetry. It's very simple. There's almost nobody has ever said it better. That poetry is memorable speech. That's it. That's all you need. 2 words. There you go. There's been books written on it, but I thought that's as good as anything, isn't it? Memorable speech, and it's really worth remembering, isn't it, that written words are speech written down. It's not the other way around. It's not that you read things and they were written down first. Children learn speech, they don't learn writing. My nieces knew my name and could say my name correctly long before their teachers could, because they just hear the sounds and repeat the sounds. They don't need to see it written down. So we need to keep remembering that the written word is crystallization of speech. So memorable speech, if we were to speak memorably, what makes something memorable is the depth of awareness of that person, the richness of their consciousness, the depth of thought, the depth of perception, the depth of being even, that they inhabit. And everyone has moments of that, even children do. Sometimes a child will say something, won't they? Recently I had my little niece, she's not quite a niece, it's a bit of a long story, but someone was saying to her, if you went to New Zealand, wouldn't you miss your daddies? Thinking of me of one of my daddies. And she said, I've only got one daddy. And this friend said, what about Maitreyabandhu? He said, oh, Maitreyabandhu is just a person. Which I thought was sort of almost inside himself, that Maitreyabandhu is just a person. He's not a daddy. Just mean that's sort of a memorable speech. You're just a person. I thought it's something that we should all remember, whatever we do, whether we're happening to sit at the front now, whether we played rugby for England, whatever we think we are, whether we're a member of a religious order or not, we need to remember that we're just a person. So all of us have moments where we have a deeper perception on life, a deeper purchase on life. And at best, that's what poetry is. That is, in my mind, what poetry is. That's what makes it memorable speech. So meditation for me opens, is a sort of gateway to depth, where I can hopefully find a way of talking which is coming from that depth. So when I meditate, what I notice mostly is that the difference between me and the natural world falls away at best. I come away from meditation and I feel that the natural world is closer to me. I feel that it's not just me looking at the trees, but they seem to start to look at me. There becomes a kind of reciprocity between us. The meditation particularly opens up for me. I sometimes have it outside of that context, but mostly not. And poetry is a natural expression of that falling down of boundaries between me and the world. That's what poetry is, in a way, is when you speak, where you and the natural world, you and other people, seem to come into a deeper relationship and harmony. And meditation, I think, opens that up. It's what somebody once said, it wasn't fair me writing poetry because Buddhism and meditation had given me a head start. And I think that's true.
I found it very interesting the way you talked about depth of perception and then moved on to discussing your niece. Because I find that in your poetry, for me, your strongest pieces are normally when you're exploring your biography, revealing to us about your relationship with your father, for example, from the fact that he would restore these old hammers but no one know quite what to do with them. And I was wondering to what extent you found that people's life histories relate to poetry, whether it's poetry gives the opportunity to explore those memories through a different light. Because in one interview you said that the poems about your childhood needed to be written rather than it was a choice.
It's funny, I mean, I remember very early on when I started writing poems, which wasn't that long ago. I was on a retreat on a writing retreat with Sally, and a poet called C.K. Williams was there, and he said, "Oh no, don't write about your childhood. You shouldn't write about your childhood." And I remember thinking, yes, he's quite right. I won't write about my childhood. There's just already too many poems about people's childhood. So I definitely decided not to. And then I wrote this poem where my childhood sort of sneaked in through the back door. And then I ended up writing all these poems about my childhood. And I still am. Not quite so many perhaps, but I still am. I think there's something endlessly revealing about our childhood somehow. I don't mean it in the Freudian sense, that Freudian nightmare of everything that went wrong is in your childhood and you have to go back and fix it. I don't believe in that anymore. But there's a sense in which life is vivider as a child so often, isn't there? I remember the landscape of my childhood more than any other landscape. It's still there, I can visit it and walk around it. It seems stronger in a way than any landscape I've been in since, even though it wasn't particularly beautiful. And I suppose I want that vividness again. But the thing I was particularly thinking about that is that all of our lives have poetry, are poetry. If you only just attend to it, our lives are already rich. I remember the reason, in that poem that I never wrote called My Childhood Was Not a Poetic Childhood, I remember thinking, nothing very important happened to me. I think I was reading Auden at the time, and his childhood was very poetic. His mother, for instance, used to take him through, play the score to Tristan and Isolde, and then sing it on the piano. It's only 6 hours long. The idea of my mother doing such a thing is just, comically unthinkable. He went to Oxford, as everybody seemed to. Nobody ever believed that I could do such a thing, and indeed didn't. But I had a very ordinary childhood. I came from a sort of lower middle class family, a country life, a country childhood in many ways. I didn't think there was much to it. I think there was anything to write poems about. Nothing grand happened to me. If anything, I had a very unhappy childhood. I was very unhappy as a child. Didn't think there was anything much to say. In a way, I wanted to escape it. But everyone's life, given the right attention, there's poems in all of our lives, if we did but know it. Our lives, anyone's life, has got great depth to it. For instance, one of the things I've been struck by is how memory and myth are often come together. I can't always tell whether this is a memory or a myth, whether a person in the poem is that person or a collection of memories of that person. I think all of our lives are rich if we did but pay attention to them. There isn't anyone that doesn't have a rich life. What's the difference is whether we pay attention to it or not. And what Buddhism is primarily is paying attention. It's the art of paying attention. Anyone, if you pay attention to your life enough, there is so much in it, of myth and symbol and poetry and drama and meaning. It's all there in your life, if you pay attention to it. And often you need help to pay attention to it. No one's life is not worthy of poetry.
Thank you. So I've been reading through the Crumb Road and enjoying it thoroughly, and what really comes clearly to me is this feeling of journey, particularly in the sort of third section with Stephen, and just exploring the person of Stephen through so many different angles and memories. Would you be willing to talk us through the journey that led you to your first collection?
The Stephen poems particularly, or perhaps let's start with that. So the collection's in 3 sections. An largely autobiographical section in the start, although some of the poems are actually meditation poems, but no one will believe me, so I had to put them in the biographical section because they look like biography and they involve biography, but they're actually descriptions of meditation. There's a poem called The Small Boy and the Mouse, which looks like a biographical poem, and it indeed does involve my biography, but it's actually a meditation experience put in the voice of a child. Anyway, you've got this biographical section, then you've got a section that's more to do with fable and myth. I'm very attracted to that. And then this sequence of poem called Stephen. I've never written a sequence before. I haven't been writing long enough to do such a thing. And I didn't realise I was writing a sequence for a long time. So what would happen is that this landscape of my childhood is very, very vivid to me, as I said, and I'm sure it is to you. It's our sort of basic landscape, isn't it? We can go back there, can't we? I think it starts to have a symbolic meaning to us, our landscape as a child. We see our landscape as a child with heightened significance. I think it may have even things to teach us. But when I went into that landscape, I'd keep meeting Stephen, this boy I knew. I remember, for instance, I was reading a poem by Derek Walcott, a wonderful poet, about his childhood in St Lucia. And I just thought, well, I'll just go back to these few fields around Henley and Arden. Every time these few fields appeared, Stephen would appear. So Stephen was a boy I was having well, difficult to say, a relationship with, a sexual relationship with. Sexual is too grand, relationship is too grand. You name it, almost anything I say about it is too grand. We started, with those sort of pre-pubescent fumblings when I was about 8, and went on till he was killed when he was 16. The only difference between same-sex relationships of that nature is that you couldn't talk about it. Prepubescent sex is, the whole thing of sex is rather difficult, isn't it? I was brought up in the Church of England. I used to go to church regularly. And, I remember praying that I wasn't gay. The only people I knew were people on television like Larry Grayson. I thought that's what you'd end up being. You walk around and say, oh, shut that door. Look at the muck in here. It's actually quite funny sometimes. But I hated it. I remember look at the muck in here. I remember that. And that was a nightmare to me. So I didn't believe it. We never talked about it. As far as we were concerned, nothing was happening. And he'd keep appearing in poem after poem. And there I go, I put them aside. And I've got this poetry mentor, Mimi Calvate, that the collection's dedicated to, who I really can't speak highly enough of as both a poet and as a mentor. I mean, I couldn't have written the poem but for her. And suddenly she said to me, look, you're writing a sequence. That's what you're doing. I mean, I'd done written poem after poem. You're writing a sequence. You need to write the sequence. And this was a new thing in my life. As soon as she said that, about 4 poems appeared immediately. Because she said, you need to write, you see you've got that and that, but I don't know, you haven't got this and this. So all these poems suddenly appeared because it was a sequence. And then she said to me, I showed them again, and she said, you need to write about his death. Until then, all of the poems were avoiding that. They allude to it, but so glancingly that you wouldn't easily know. So I wrote a poem about his death, a long poem called The Mop. And she read it, she said, oh, I really like this poem. You need to write about the death. I hadn't. So I then finally found it, because how do you write about death? So I finally found a very flat way of writing about it at the end of a poem. The only way you can write about it is to say what happened. As soon as you say how you feel about it, problematizes it. I wanted it to be itself. I didn't want my own egotism to get in the way of it, to embellish it, to talk about me. It didn't happen to me. He died when he was 16. I didn't. And of course the fact that he died when he was 16 meant I could never talk to him about it. We never talked then, and there was no place of ever going back and saying, what did you think? What happened? So the whole sequence is not, I don't know quite what it is, the sequence. They're not love poems quite. They sort of have that aspect. They're not quite elegies, although they have that aspect. They're also poems about what happened, mainly. Is that true? Did that happen then, or did that happen then? Did I feel that, or did I feel this? Did I care or not care? And it was that haunted me. I mean, he literally haunted me for years. So when I meditate, he'd quite often appear to me, as it were. I've never been haunted. I don't feel myself to have those sort of experiences, but I was haunted by him. I remember there's a poem in this collection where there is really just what happened. I was on a solitary retreat, where you're on a retreat. I think I was on a retreat for 2 weeks on my own, and you get very sensitized. You go much deeper into life, and you get very, very sensitive. And I have these experiences that if I relaxed my legs to a particular point, Stephen would appear. And one day I was washing up, and suddenly he was standing behind me. I mean, I'm not given to this kind of thing. I come from the Midlands, folks. You're not allowed to have those sort of experiences in the Midlands. They don't let you. But he was standing behind me and slightly to my right. I mean, it was as accurate as that. And he seemed to want to ask me something, of course. And it was so vivid, I actually said his name out loud, Stephen. And then there was a sense of him just thinking, I can't ask this question. It can't be resolved. And this sense of a shrug almost, and him leaving me. What's slightly interesting, or even slightly chilling to me, is that when I completed the sequence, which has taken me 7 years to write, I mean, you'd never believe it, but it's taken me 7 years to write. With poetry, I never spend so long writing so little. It took me 7 years to write. When I finished it, he's not there anymore. It's really odd. I've written a final poem called Excellent, which I probably won't publish, I don't think, but it was a poem where I thought, okay, let me just go back and talk to him again and go back to that landscape, and is there anything else? I went to this place, and it's all to do with places. My mind, my memory, I don't remember sex very much, I think mainly because nothing, frankly, happened. I don't remember saying anything, I don't remember so much. I mostly remember places. I remember the walk to a den, I remember places, really, really vividly. A particular tree, a bit of fencing, a stile, a path. I remember those things vividly. I could sort of plan them out in the room. Don't remember how I felt. I don't remember anything I said. So I went back to all the places, and he wasn't there. I mean, in nowhere was he there. It was really quite spooky. He just wasn't there. The garage that I used to walk past wasn't there. The walnut tree wasn't there. He wasn't there. And I still can't decide what I think about that, whether that's good or not. I hope that it does something, that somehow the dead can then, whatever that means, can live again, can carry on. But that might be sentimental, it might be me. I slightly sometimes fear that I've killed him again. Do you know what I mean? That he doesn't live anymore, that if he lives in these poems. But I can't go back to him anymore. I'm not sure whether I like that. To me, there's a chill in that for me. Have I betrayed him in some way, even myself, by making them into things on paper? Is that a good thing or not? I really don't know. I'd like to think it's a sort of you allow the dead to move on, but I don't know. Perhaps I've trespassed on something, and perhaps these things should never be written. But he's not there anymore. He's gone. In a way that he was alive to me when I was writing them again. Even though if I saw him, if he was in the audience now as a 16-year-old boy, I probably wouldn't be able to recognise him. He'd have to tell me his name. And yet he was so vivid to me. So yeah, I mean, the journey of writing a collection is a long journey. The journey of those poems. You know, the book took me 7 years to write. I've written other books and they don't take that long. Poetry is a mad thing to do. If you can help it, don't do it. Just stop yourself now. In another world, it would be like a compulsive obsessive disorder. You just keep going over the same thing again and again. Especially nowadays, I'm writing more and more in rhyme. I'm trying to write short kind of lyrical poems. I've written, finally, I hope, finished one. It's taken me a year to write. It's 3 verses long with 4 lines each. I just think, surely there are better things to do. So they take forever. And the poems just do.
Thank you. So a last question from me. Aside from the advice of stop now.
Yeah, stop now. That's what they say. Or just leave them in your notebook. Because it's lovely, isn't it? You write a little thing, and it gives you that, that's good.
I know for a fact that in the audience we've got writers, poets, artists, photographers. For those wanting to engage with the spiritual life within their creativity, what advice would you give?
For those wanting to do both, practice the spiritual life and poetic life. I mean, I shouldn't be too rude about poetry. It's given me so much. I've always really struggled with finding a way of bringing spiritual life and my artistic life together. So I painted for a long time. I used to paint on retreat sometimes. I used to paint in my room, in my community. Painting's not a thing I can cart around with me. Everywhere I go, I've got a big folder of my poems which I fiddle with. I was fiddling with them on the train on the way here, crammed in this little carriage. That's all you're doing when you write. I mean, that is it. Is that right? You want to say it, and I'm going to crouch the other side of the room and hear it. Is there a... It's really, that's all you do. It's like a mad person. But I've never been able to have an art practice which is so sewn into my life that I can do it on the train on the way here. Really practical thing. I couldn't carry on with the painting. And poetry has given me this. It has unified very much my spiritual life and my artistic life, because at rare best, and let's not, for instance, I don't call me a poet because I'm not a poet. I think calling yourself a poet is like saying you've gained insight or something. It's a grand word. It's vulgar to call oneself a poet, just as like it would be vulgar to call oneself, I don't know, to say you've gained insight or something like that in the Buddhist tradition. I find it vulgar. The poet, I will get around to your question. The poet Michael Longley says that it's like calling yourself a saint, calling yourself a poet. Louis MacNeice's first wife, every time anyone called MacNeice a poet, she got angry and said, you're only allowed to call that somebody if they're dead. Which I thought was rather good. But it has, so despite all those caveats, it has given me another way to depth, which unifies my desire to create, which I've always had actually, even as a child, and my desire to practice the Dharma, practice Buddhism, sometimes in a miraculous way that you wouldn't believe, like rhyme, for instance. Sometimes you're just following the rhyme. I've written a poem recently which was really just questioning me, what rhymes with plan? Plan, Kurdistan, Uzbekistan. I mean, this is a good example. I was writing a poem about a dear friend of mine, Mohanandu, who died a few years ago now. And I had a dream, and he came back to me in a dream after he died. And he tried to tell me everything that happened since he died. It was really striking because he came into the dream. I wasn't dreaming about it. Came to the dream and tried to tell me. So I've been trying to write this poem about him, coming back and telling me. So I decided that in the poem I'd say all the things he was trying to say in the dream. And I got to this place, it's in rhyming couplets, which you think, oh my God, it'll kill me. And I got to a place, your plan, right word. And I thought, no, when you came back from Kurdistan. Doesn't sound very good. So he'd done this long journey, you see, before he died, he'd gone on this long journey. So I wrote to a friend of his who went with him. And I said, I'm looking for a rhyme for plan. I mean, you've all done that, haven't you? Emailed a friend saying, I'm looking for a rhyme for plan. So I said, went on your journey together. Did you go to Uzbekistan or Kurdistan? He said, no, but we did go to Xi'an. Now Xi'an, so this is spooky. So when you went to China and Xi'an, much nicer rhyme word. It's got a particular word for in rhyme. But what's interesting about that is what's at Xi'an is the terracotta soldiers. Now this whole poem was about Mohananda. Mohananda's, one of the most important things about his life was that, perhaps I could even read it. Let me see. One of the important things about his life is that his mother was in Auschwitz. I mean, that, in a way, in his life, his whole life was the history of Europe. So it's all about the war. It's about what I call the European stain in the poem, which is about this sort of incredible anti-Semitism which is in European life, so virulent and hateful, that's been there for so long. So there we are. It's a poem already about war. It's about the atrocities of war. I was just looking for a rhyme for plan, because I wanted to say, when you got back, you said to me you wanted to go on the inward journey. And I thought, but not as far as this. Not as far as this, yeah. So do you see how that rhyme for plan with Xi'an, which is all about the terracotta soldiers, which is all about, which is a way of showing that war is always there. Do you mean that the terracotta soldiers, it's war again, it's all of that. So that suddenly just following that rhyme, it's as if life is a poem, if only you can find it. And sometimes all you need to do is, you have to find it. You have to follow the rhyme until you find it. It's not yours, it's in life. Do you see what I mean? So poetry has given me this incredible new path to depth. But I think that poetry and Buddhism are doing the same thing. I think actually Buddhism goes further because it goes beyond language. But if I was to give any advice for doing the both, is do the both more and more fully, more and more rigorously, and really be careful of your ambition. Sally and I were meeting and talking before, and I was bemoaning my own ambition. I'm a very ambitious man. I didn't think I was, but I am ambitious. And in the small world of poetry, it's a very ambitious world. And I found my ambition has been provoked again. I think there's a good ambition where you try to write better, and we should all have that. But then there's the ambition to publish, to be known, to be published, to win competitions and so on. And I'm afraid I've been rather disheartened by that in my son. How I can tell you all the reasons not to be, but my ambition is there nevertheless. The only valuable thing about that kind of ambition is the pain of disappointment, which I've been experiencing more. And and what does that show up about me? About my egotism, really. So, if you're not careful, creative life actually provokes ambition. Creative life, like Buddhist life, is supposed to be going beyond life. It's supposed to be going beyond who we think we are. The whole purpose and meaning of the arts is to take us a little bit beyond who we are just now. Unfortunately, it's also got kudos and poshness around it. So if you're not careful, it actually creates more egotism. So I think it is quite dangerous, spiritually, if you mean. But you will want to publish, you need to publish because you want other people to read your stuff. That's the whole point. It's not therapy. So yes, do both more deeply until both compete with each other. So that my Buddhist life keeps on saying, well, you need to give more and more of my life to that. My poetry life wants to claw back time. But I'm hoping that they counteract the ambition in both, because you can be spiritually ambitious as well, which is even sort of more vulgar in a way. Bad enough to be ambitious in poetry, but to be ambitious in spiritual life is very bad indeed. But hopefully I'm hoping that the tension between them creates a deeper me, a better me, a more genuinely valuable me that can be some good in the world. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to ask if anyone in the audience has any questions they'd like to ask Maitreyabandhu. Thank you.
I just wondered, one thing I wanted to ask you about was publishing and validation.
Validation, yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel that I look towards publishing as some kind of validation of my experience in a way, or a certain view of the world, which might not be heard.
Yes. Yes.
So I think
that's very interesting.
Motivated me.
I mean, the first thing I want to say is that don't look for publication in terms of validation of your experience. Look at it in terms of validation of your writing, which are two quite different things, I think. There are people I know with very deep experience who don't write well, but whose experience is quite obviously very deep. There are people who write well and who don't have much depth of experience. I don't think good writing naturally flows out of deep experience. You can have very deep thought and not write well. You can write very well and not have deep thought. What publication does, if it does anything very much, is that it's been looked at by someone who's read a lot of stuff. Like when I was going to say, but Sheffield for me is a city of poetry, because I used to enter the poetry book and pamphlet competition every year. If you're writing poetry, just enter it every year. I used to do it as a kind of religious festival, like planting money in the ground, and nothing would grow. And one year, I won it, and along with 3 others. And one of the things that was so exciting was people whose estimation of writing I value very highly. That did validate me, I think. So I think you can look for that sort of validation, though it doesn't last very long.
I just wondered if you could give me an example of somebody you thought wrote well and didn't have that depth of experience.
Oh dear.
To me, if you write well, you have to write.
Sorry? If you write well?
If you write well, you have to write what I would call writing well, anyway.
Yeah.
Right from.
Yes, it's funny, I was thinking on the train, is that true? But then what about light verse? You know, like what about Auden? Auden writes every which way. You know, he can write like, no, Auden is just outrageous. He can write better than you in everything you ever did. But, you know, he can go more serious than you, but also write actually very funny work, or funny work that's quite clearly not supposed to be deep. And I think there's a place for that. Well, think of the poem like Jabberwocky. Is that deep experience? It's beautiful, but you couldn't learn much more about life from it. It's just pure art, like Mozart. You know, at times with Mozart you don't know whether it's deep. It's just pure music. With Bach, it's always about God. With Handel, I think it's always about human feeling. With Mozart, it's not about anything. It's just about dum 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 dum. I'm on a roll here. It's just sort of perfect creation. It's like snow crystals, isn't it? But it's not talking about anything, I think. Auden can write light verse that's wonderful, you know. I have one in my mind, it's just gone, but he can also write deeply. A while ago I interviewed Wendy Cope, who I think is a very good poet and unjustly overlooked, I think. Because her work is accessible and often funny, people don't take her seriously enough. She's actually very, very good at what she does, and at best it is, you know, up there with someone like Larkin at the very best. But she writes quite a lot of light verse as well, which is enjoyable, but I wouldn't say it's deep. I wouldn't say it's shallow either, actually, but I wouldn't say it's deep. At times she'll write very deep work, including funny work. Things that are funny can actually be very deep, I think. But I think you need more words than deep, because of the issue of things like light verse, nonsense, poetry. I recently wrote a nonsense poem. Everyone should write a nonsense poem at one time in their life, shouldn't they? It's actually very difficult to do, write a good nonsense poem. Why? I don't know. It should be easy to do nonsense, shouldn't it? But it's actually very difficult.
Thank you. Do we have questions from anyone else? Another question that came for me was when you were talking about the interview. Would you like to tell us more about your experiences with Poetry East?
Oh yes, so I founded Poetry East. Actually, I hope I'm not rude here, but it actually came from going to, poetry was quite new to me. I went to a reading, and it was awful, absolutely awful. I went to two. I went to one reading where I was reading. And first of all, it was in this little crowded little space, quite a lot of people, so I thought, well, that's good. I was late on in the reading list. And what was happening is people would come up and read. They'd read, frankly, far too long. And like they keep saying, "Do you mind if I read another one?" We'd all say, "Please stop now." And then they'd read another one. I was at the end. What would happen is they'd read, then they'd go home. By the time it got to me, there's about 3 people. So I was very miffed about that. And then I went to another reading, and it was just awful. I just thought, there was no framing, it wasn't done very well, the space wasn't very conducive, the poems frankly weren't read very well. And I just thought, the worst amateur dramatic play would be a better evening than this. I thought we must be able to do better. So that's really why it came out of a criticism, really. And more recently I went to what it was, a launch or something. And I mean, it was like a cartoon of contemporary poetry. I thought, I just can't believe it. There's one poem which mainly made up words. What am I doing? I'm going mad. You know. So it came out of a criticism. And what I've been feeling more and more is that I'd like more people to read poetry. There's so much in it that's so good. It's just the word is putting people off more and more. You may as well say, would you like to read religious literature or something? And she said, no. Just the word has got that kind of, would you like to read the words of a saint? Would you like to read The Guardian? Oh, that sounds more interesting. The Sunday supplement. The word itself has become unhelpful. I wish we had a better word. But there's such good stuff. I mean, like for instance, on my retreat, I was reading Hardy again. Hardy is probably a greater poet than he is even a novelist. I mean, the poems are just like, you just want to curl up and die when you've read one, because they're just so good. You just think, well, I'll never be able to write so well. I just think that more people need a bit of a leg up. Nobody helps you. There's always got this religious thing about it, where if you ask, excuse me, what's he talking about? You look a fool. So what I wanted to do was do what you're doing here. I wanted you to say to the poet, okay, what are you doing? Why do you do it? What's it about? What makes you write? What's your life been like? And what I've hoped from that is that people will then be able to get a bit of a leg up into poetry. And I hope I have made a little contribution in that way. I think many more people would read poetry if somebody would help them a bit more. Help them see why it's so good at best. So that's what I've been trying to do. And I've managed to attract really very good people. I've been very, very fortunate. And I've tried to ask them sometimes, pointing questions, if I could. Sometimes they wrestle me to the ground, as it were. But I've really enjoyed it, actually. I've really enjoyed it. But I think we need a hand, don't we?
Sorry, just a question. You talked quite a lot about depth. And you talked about like agonising over a 4-line poem. And I just wondered, but kind of conscious of that, you always kind of hint at sometimes quite a superficial thing. You said when it makes out with on a roll. But I just wondered what you think about sort of using the subconscious and kind of, rushing things out as being a helpful tool in art. Sometimes you hear about pop songs being rattled off in 3 minutes by the Beatles. Do you know what I mean? I just wonder, do you ever find that sometimes, you just get going with art and it can be very helpful to do it in that kind of a way?
I mean, sometimes, increasingly rarely now, but sometimes, yeah. Like I remember when I went to see Sangratchita, the founder of this movement, I said, look, the only thing I can say in defence of my poem Bantu is I spent a long time on them. He said, that doesn't say anything about their quality. Straight away, that doesn't say anything about their quality. You're quite right. Nothing says anything about quality of work. Writing it fast, writing it slow, so what? Keats said, didn't he, that unless poems come like leaves to the tree, they better not come at all, which makes it sound like they come very naturally. Some people write occasionally, and there's a poem here called Visitation, which I'll read later on, which I pretty much wrote down. I've hardly changed it. It was almost one draft, not quite, but two. Another poem here, Rangiatea, which I think is my most ambitious single poem, took 95 drafts and 3 years, by which time you think you need to go and have therapy. So one thing that can be confusing is people talk about spontaneity, but again they link that with time. That to be spontaneous is to be quick. That's not true. You can be working on something 95 drafts later and be spontaneous. You can not be spontaneous and quick. So I think speed writing, particularly when you first start writing, is very helpful. What it can do is get out of the way of your highly conscious, critical mind. So speed writing I don't find that now. It's when you're writing, particularly poems, you've got this weird balance between being conscious and being unconscious. And if you get that balance wrong, you won't be able to write. You need to both know what you're doing and have no idea what you're doing. In fact, the more you don't know, the better. The more you just need to write it. A poem that came to my mind recently, I had this first line that said, when I gave you your name, you wept aloud. And as soon as that line came, and actually knew it was a rhyming sonnet, would you believe? Well, you've all heard that. Oh, come on. I didn't even know what more I wanted to say about that. So you have this strange balance of being conscious about what you're doing and not knowing. And be careful to try to know the right things well, like know form and technique. You need to know that much more deeply. But be careful not to know about your unconscious motives. You need to leave them alone. Robert Frost was always nervous about people writing his biography because he said, look, I might write about that at some point. I might have a poem in that sometime. So I don't want to talk to you about that in case I kill it. You see what I mean? Be careful of trespassing onto what you mustn't know, because the poem needs to tell you it. You see what I mean? Sometimes at the end of your poem you think, oh, that's what I was writing about. Like, just to give a last example, in a meditation I suddenly saw this picture of orange blossom when I was a child, very, very vividly. So I seemed to think I want to write about this orange blossom. So I started by writing about orange blossom. What was that about? The dogs, something about the dogs. Well, the dogs would howl near the orange blossom. And that was because there was a siren that used to go that was left over from the war that was used for fire emergencies. And all the firemen would run to the fire station. And they'd go, oh, they'd howl like wolves just by the orange blossom. So then I write about that, and then it reminds me of something else. Eventually, I got back to my father as a child, sitting on the doorstep with my grandmother, watching Zeppelins going over the house. And that had, that completely unknown. It's a poem about history, about all the way from Orange Blossom was a child for me in 1965, going all the way back to the First World War and Zeppelins. Which I mean, that's a lovely thing to discover, to find just from Orange Blossom. In fact, there's no Orange Blossom in the poem. It's called Orange Blossom, but almost commemoratively. You think. So had I gone through all that, I would have not had a poem. So be conscious in the right way and unconscious in the right way.
We have time for one more question.
I was interested in what you said about Mimi Kalvati and her role as a mentor.
Yeah.
Would you like to say something about that and how that came about and how that works?
Oh yes, indeed. I mean, the first thing I really want to say is just to rejoice in Mimi Kalvati. So I don't know whether anyone's read her work, but I'd really recommend it. She'll have a new collection out next year. The collection I particularly recommend is The Meanest Flower, which is wonderful. I won her. Sounds like in a raffle. But I won a series of mentoring. And that I've never learned, so outside of Buddhism, I've never learned so much from anyone so quickly as learning from her. So I take along a poem, and I remember one time I took this poem, which I was rather proud of, and she looked at it and she said, I don't think there's a poem in this. I just put it aside. And then I remember one time, this is very early on, I'll read it later on, a poem I'd written called Bottle Digging, about my father and I digging for bottles when I was young. And she read it and she said, yes, I like it. It's a good poem, there's a lot in it. I can't really fault it, but why is it not wonderful? Why is it not wonderful? And I thought, and she said, well, one of the reasons why it's not wonderful is because it's not in pentameter. It's not in meter. So it hasn't got a kind of backbone that kind of pulls it all together. So she said, I think actually it's trying to be. So look at the first line, that's in a pentameter line. And look at this paragraph here, the first line there, it's a pentameter line. So I think the whole poem wants to be in pentameter. And I nodded, thinking, no idea how to do that. So then I went home and gradually I learned to write in meter. You know what I mean? Only she could have seen that. She had this kind of, any really good mentor has a capacity to see, never mind what do you want, but what does the poet want? You have to have a very, very deep understanding of poetry, and I mean all of its forms, I mean its history, I mean its great tradition, to know what a poem is trying to be. So I remember another time I showed her a poem, and she said, yeah, this is good, it's quite clearly trying to be a sestina, isn't it? I said, oh, yeah. And I thought, no idea what it is. Ran home, Googled Sestina. So, because of all the repeating words. So off I go. She said, I think it's trying to be a Sestina. Why don't you try and write it as Sestina? Unfortunately, I wasn't honest enough to admit in this group I didn't know what that was. So I went home, Googled Sestina, and tried to write it as Sestina. And Bob's your uncle. You write it as Sestina, and it's much better. So it's not, with poems, it's often there's nothing wrong with them, there's just not enough right with them. One of the things often not right is that you've not attended to the form. Mimi always says to me, it takes a day to write the poem and a week to find the form. And if you find the form brings out the poem in a miraculous way. So as soon as it became a sestina, suddenly what I had to say got focused by the form in a way that I could never have done. That's what form does at best. It takes you further. I could never have done that without a mentor, I think. The best other way of doing it is being a part of a poetry group, but if you can get a mentoring, this was a Joad Harvard mentoring that I won originally. I've actually won another one later on. But her grasp of what a poem is trying to do, just see, I think you're trying to do this, was just wonderful. And also the opposite. So when I got to know forms, I remember writing a villanelle, which I've wanted to write all my life, well, since I've been writing poems. And I wrote it to her, and she said, yes, don't publish it, it's not good enough. I was terribly proud of it. She said, yes, don't publish it. It's just you trying to practice it. It's not really a villanelle. It hasn't really come. How she could tell that, I just don't know. At the time, I would have said, publish it now, in which you always think. But she knows it just so much more deeply. She could tell that it was a practice work. It was redoing my scales, you see what I mean? I couldn't tell that. I would have thought it was wonderful, just because I was so surprised to get the rhyming scheme right. You know what I mean? So I'd really recommend trying to get mentoring, and I'd particularly recommend anything that you can learn with her. I haven't been taught by many other poets, but she's, as both a poet and a person, she is a person who I think is deep and writes well. In fact, she's extremely intelligent in the very best sense. So I'd very much recommend her. And if you can get a mentor, I think it is the way of deepening your craft.
Could you just tell me her name, please?
Mimi, M-I-M-I, Khalvati, Khalvati is how you, K-H-A-L-V-A-T-I. Her selected poems with a carcanet, and she's a carcanet author.
And that, the Sestina?
The Sestina. Do you want to spell it?
Yeah, please.
S-E-S-T-I-N-A. It's an ancient form of poems with a repeating end words,
right.
Which I hope to have some in my second collection. But don't try and write one because it's just terrible. The only thing, or just make it a bit more difficult to write a villanelle, which will probably cause you all sorts of problems.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Maitreyabandhu, for talking with me. We're going to break for tea now, and then we'll return shortly where we'll get to hear more from the Crown Road.
Thank you very much.